Pleased to be here again in partnership with the Center and the LBJ School, and especially glad to be here today with our guest, the Honorable Bill White, who in a few months will conclude 3 terms as the mayor of Houston. Mayor White was first elected to lead the state's largest city and the nation's 4th largest city in 2003, and he's been twice re-elected with more than 85% of the vote. He ran that first time as a moderate with a business background, emphasizing calm and competence above all else, and he has lived up to his own billing. His record in office has been characterized by what Sam Gwynn calls, in a profile of Mr. White in the new issue of Texas Monthly, a quiet, bipartisan, consensus-building approach. He famously got high marks for his handling of evacuees in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, but it's the workaday challenges rather than the once-in-a-lifetime catastrophes that ultimately determine any mayor's success. And on the most mundane and routine aspects of big city life, traffic jams and green space, pensions and pollution, energy consumption and crime, Mr. White has exceeded the expectations of even his most harsh critics. Not that there are many, as Sam Gwynn notes in that same Texas Monthly article, which Rich Connolly in the Houston Press described this morning as a big old slobbering wet kiss. Mr. White is the most popular mayor of Houston in memory. Sam doesn't slobber that much, does he? Not that I remember. Before all this, before all the accolades and the accomplishments, Bill White was a kid from San Antonio, the son of school teachers. He attended Harvard University and then law school right here at the University of Texas, graduating with highest honors. After a successful career as an attorney at a big Houston firm, he served as Deputy Secretary of Energy in the Clinton administration and later as chairman of the Texas Democratic Party. During that time, he also put together an oil and gas play in the Caspian Sea and served as president and CEO of an energy and real estate company. You would imagine that after so many years in the public eye, Mayor White would be itching to get back to his old life and to some measure of privacy. But instead, he's decided to seek the U.S. Senate seat now occupied by Kay Bailey Hutchison, who apparently plans to resign in 2040. He is running hard as a Democrat at a time when his party hasn't won a statewide election in 15 years, but hey, he's a can-do guy. Whatever your political persuasion, please join me in welcoming a truly decent public servant and a great Texan, Bill White.
Thank you.
Welcome, Mr. Mayor. It is still Mr. Mayor for a little while longer,
That's
isn't
right,
it?
that's right.
Do you have any pranks planned at the end there for your successor? Like if Miss Parker wins, you'll take all the P's off of your computer keyboards?
I hadn't thought of that far.
Maybe you can
no
pardon
pranks.
Cecil Cooper or something like that?
No pranks, no pranks.
No. What do you expect to do in the last couple of weeks? When you get to this point with the end in sight, do you wind down or do you have one last thing that you want to accomplish before taking a victory lap?
A great question, Evan. I mean, for the last several months, we've been going through things to-do lists and commitments that have been made and finding out what the status of each of those things is and trying to wrap what we committed to do up. Obviously, there's a lot of projects that are in progress. Yeah. And for those, we want to make sure there's good continuity. Mm-hmm. And I'm blessed because both of the people in the runoff are some of the principal pillars of what we've tried to accomplish in the administration say that they want to finish things that we've begun. So
you don't have, just to stay with the 2 potential successors, you don't have a horse in that race?
No.
So if Ms. Parker or Mr. Locke ended up as the next mayor of Houston, you would continue as a resident of that city unless you end up in a different city, hint, hint. You would be comfortable with either one as mayor of Houston?
Oh, sure.
They're both qualified in your mind, equally qualified?
I'm not going to get into commenting on the candidates, but I do think that we can be proud that Houston has had a succession of mayors, of which I'm just the latest, who celebrates the diversity of our community. Right. And tries to move our city forward. And that a succession of mayors has avoided trying to divide our city into groups and pit them, our citizens, against each other. Right. And that's one reason why it has been easy or easier than a lot of big cities to get people moving in the same direction, which is the principal job of a big city mayor. Right.
Now, you indicated a moment ago to me before we began that you were not going to endorse a candidate in the runoff unless somebody did something that you consider to be crossing the line between now and the runoff date. You want to elaborate a little bit on that for me?
Well, not so much an endorsement, but I will intrude in the public debate if somebody crosses a line, which I don't expect either of these two candidates to do so. I took some of the same attitudes in a number of local races. And there was a time when there was a candidate in the last election cycle who ran a scurrilous, non-factual, negative ad accusing, in this case, a candidate for sheriff of something wrong, trying to make a youthful indiscretion a big deal for a hardworking public servant. And I said, you know, I'm going to come out strong unless you pull that ad down.
It wasn't that the ad was factually wrong. It was just that you felt that it had no place in the debate.
It had no place in the debate, and it insinuated things that were wrong.
Right.
And it had no place in the debate, insinuated it was really character assassination of a very low sort. And I said, I'm going to go up with my own ads unless you pull it down. And it was pulled down.
You were successful. So let's go right to the heart of the potential for that in this runoff. Ms. Parker, who is one of the two remaining candidates for mayor, is a lesbian, is openly gay, and has, in fact, released not only her tax returns, but her partner's tax returns to the nonprofit group Texas Watchdog. I believe Mr. Locke has not yet released his tax returns. And there's a whisper campaign going on in Houston about Ms. Parker's sexual orientation, not that it's a secret, but that Mr. Locke's campaign may, through surrogates, resort to using her sexual orientation as a bludgeon against her in the runoff. Would that qualify, if her sexual orientation is used by the Locke campaign or its surrogates against her, would you then feel like you had to intrude in that race?
The Locke campaign, yes, but when people say it's surrogates, you got to be careful, because I hear a lot of conspiracy theories in politics.
There are a couple, that's right.
And the same thing is if people, this could have been true, 15 years ago, if the fact that Mr. Locke was African American, if people made some overtly ethnic appeal or ethnic slander or campaign against somebody who's African American, I would feel the same way. But I believe that both of the campaigns understand that that would tend to backfire. And it's to a credit to the people of Houston, where we've come from and where we are now, and the climate of civic leadership that I've tried to nurture, that I believe it would be more of a backlash than a plus for any candidate to be associated with that.
Would you have run for a fourth term if you were not prohibited from doing so?
Probably not.
No, you weren't going to pull a Mike Bloomberg on us and spend $100 million to get reelected?
Yeah.
Were you done in your own mind? Did you feel like 6 years was a sufficient amount of time to be mayor? Because obviously some cities do 2 terms, some cities have unlimited terms. Did it work for you?
As a generic answer that would be applicable to a number of mayors, I think that 6 years, as opposed to maybe 8 or 10, something like that, is a little short a period of time, because
a
little short because there's major capital projects and other things. Just my judgment in getting a handle on all the issues involving city government, especially if somebody had no city government experience. For me personally, I tend to be somebody who works hard and is demanding on myself and sometimes others. And I think that people in public life, particularly in executive positions, tend to get stale after a while, or they tend to, think they know everything. So I think it was just right amount of time for me, and I can speak personally.
So there's been no period in this last term where you felt like you were marking time until the end, kind of like one of those prisoners in a movie checking X's off on days. You were actually still as energized toward the end here as you were at the beginning.
Absolutely. And, we've accomplished a tremendous amount so far. And I'm going to be working until the last day on the job, just because that's what I was hired to do.
Right. Why did you want to be mayor to begin with? You had had a successful career in business. You had made a little bit of money. You'd worked in politics at the party level. You'd obviously worked in Washington in an appointed position that was, pretty high up in government. For some people, being mayor is a grind. People would consider being mayor of a big city with all the problems of a big city, never enough resources, never enough time, to be something that they would avoid doing, but you ran toward it. Why was that?
Well, I'll tell you, I had been involved in some issues involving civic leadership, trying to get more green space and trying to reduce the pollution as well as a number of other things within the community, trying to get more health clinics. That was another one. And I always felt a little frustrated that I knew what the answer was, but it was hard to get it through. Inertia isn't just a law of physics. And so if you have your hands on the steering wheel in a strong mayor form of government, you can make a pretty sharp turn, and it doesn't need to be something that occurs, that fits and starts. Frankly, though, it had not crossed my mind, because I'd been involved in federal issues. I enjoyed running businesses. I loved that. I wasn't bored until there were groups of citizens, very diverse group of citizens, shortly after the election preceding mine, who came to me and said, you need to run for mayor. And then they laid out a case. And I was a pretty hard sell for quite a while.
So you had to be persuaded.
I had to be persuaded.
Right. What was the concern on your part about running or about serving? What made you need to be persuaded?
Well, honestly, I hadn't quite thought about it. I had been involved in national energy policy and international diplomacy. I enjoyed building businesses. As a matter of fact, some of the businesses were built for the period of time, between 2000 and 2010. I thought we would drill for more natural gas. I thought it was important to the energy future. Mm-hmm. I thought natural gas prices would go up, so I was building firms to find natural gas. Right. And I could see it coming, what did eventually occur. So I got off of that a little earlier than I wanted. But, my old friend, former Senator Lloyd Benson, told me he'd been encouraging me to run for office for some time. And the one time I remember a conversation of his on the plane. He says, just look, whatever you do, you'd be good at it, but don't run for mayor. And
that was the one thing he said, don't
run for mayor.
And what was his issue with running for mayor?
And I said, well, why do you say that? The potholes or he says, hey, it's the only job in politics where every day you live among your customers and you can never get away from the job. And you know what? He was absolutely right.
He was exactly
absolutely
right. Let's talk about your 6 years. Rather than have me tick off a list of things that you accomplished or things that, to ask you to comment on, why don't you tell me, when the history of your time as mayor is written, what will the 3 or 4 things be that people spend the most time focusing on? And it can be positive or negative.
Well, the first thing, I don't know what they'll write about because it's the underpinning for the other things, which is bringing people together from disparate backgrounds. It sounds cliche, but I mean, we had people from the far right and the far left on city council. And yes, in any big cities, there are those who appeal to ethnic politics and make ethnic appeals, and they were made by some of my opponents during the course of a mayoral campaign. And getting people to realize that we have a lot more in common in a city than differ, and we're stronger. That is something that I spend a lot of time on, and I don't take for granted, and is a legacy that I'll think I'll leave the next mayor. But history will be written about more tangible things. Right. And of course, it was something big in the life of the city when we went through the experience of Katrina and had the source of civic pride that we were able to turn a disaster for others into a triumph for America, that a group of people was able to get together and provide relief and help lives be put back. And
maybe the best manifestation of what you describe as bringing the community.
And you got to bring it together. So we divided it up. And the relations I built with the faith-based community, the corporate community, people in nonprofit organizations, that's where we could work side by side. Another thing that I think will be written about more and more as time goes on is the huge advances that the city of Houston has made on energy efficiency, renewables, cleaning the air, adding to parks and green space. Where so many times those of us who are from Texas are thought of as being, we're from a natural resource consumption state and production state, not for good stewardship of the resources that we've inherited.
You say that many of us from Texas are thought of that way?
Yeah, we're thought of that way.
Is that a misperception? Because it sounds in many cases just exactly right to me.
Well, I think the majority, I think the politicians and pundits were way behind where the heads of Texans are these days. I think people who are fiscal conservatives, like me, like the idea that we would spend less money for the electricity in the city of Houston because we would build extraordinarily energy efficient buildings. You kill two birds with one stone. The idea of energy efficiency in residences, if everybody can have a good quality of life and use less, who wants to pay for a big new coal-fired power plant? It doesn't come for free. And so I think my battle with the polluters along the ship channel, I'll tell you what, I heard virtually no public voices in opposition, although the lobbyists and lawyers were working full-time against us on that. So I think Texans share, we want to be good stewards of the natural resources. We're proud of our land and our water. I haven't heard anybody who ever wants their kid to get asthma because of something they breathe. But it's just the strides that we made in turning that corner in Houston, I think will have long-lasting implications for not only our own community, but the public of this state, and show some leadership. And finally, I'll tell you, what we're doing in some of the blighted neighborhoods of the city, neighborhoods that had been ignored and discriminated against in the provision of infrastructure because of the shameful legacy of segregation and disempowerment of some of our citizens, where we have a lot of catching up to do, houses that were falling down, becoming crack houses, close to major employment centers. And people said you can't do anything because they're long-term tax delinquent, because it's a high crime area, because you need to replace infrastructure. And now hundreds and hundreds of new affordable houses are coming up in those communities. And I've spent more of my personal time on that than anything else. And I think if we could do that across this nation and across this state, have good, affordable housing close to major employment centers, will reduce crime, will put property back on the tax rolls, and be able to provide more public services. And above all, will give people who are now living in apartments the independence and the ability to build wealth in home ownership.
The list of things that you've mentioned and other things you haven't mentioned that have always been part of the way your term in office has been characterized, are they challenges endemic to any big city? Are they challenges endemic to Houston specifically?
Neither. All cities, everywhere, yeah. Small, large.
Right, doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter.
Whether you're big city or small city, you've got problems with roads, you have problems with crime, you have problems with green space, and
exactly.
So, how much of this was a case of you inheriting from the previous mayor problems that had some urgency that needed to be solved?
Well, you know,
because he was not perceived to be, by a lot of people, a very successful mayor.
You know, I have never, in all these years, sort of getting commentary on the decisions or performance of my successors, because I've never figured out how to change the past. If I did, then I wouldn't need to run for pod, bottle it, sell it, give all the money to the foundation or something. So there were some things that are, you know, chronic problems in any city that goes from one administration to another. Whenever there's violent crime, there's too much violent crime. There is an issue which has been neglected in all cities and all states. Well, virtually all big cities, yep, and all states right now, where we addressed it up front, we addressed it early, aggressively, and I think American cities as a whole and states, and probably the federal government, are yet to address it, and that is public employee pension reforms.
Talk about that.
We're seeing the consequences in California right now. We're seeing it in New Jersey, New York, and the East Coast. Chicago, Illinois, Wisconsin have had crises in the past, and it all boils down to this, that it was a bad bargain to have a civil service system which said, look, we'll make it hard, we may not pay you what you're worth, but you can keep your job regardless of performance, and then when you don't work, after you leave, you'll make a lot more money than people who didn't work for a public entity. What kind of deal is that? That's not performance-oriented government. And people said people would never understand pension reform. It was all a matter of actuaries. The unions fought it because I honestly believe in my heart that some of them did not understand their members. I didn't want to take away anything that was vested, but unless something is affordable for the long run, it's not going to be secure for the long run. It's a different day when you have the average life expectancy 64, 65 years than when you have life expectancies in the high 70s and low 80s. It's a different day when we did not have the ability to treat chronic conditions that we now have the ability to treat. And so we got to adjust these pension systems to make sure that public entities are not paying more for their retirees than they're paying for their active duty personnel. Otherwise, we'll become like General Motors. You see, General Motors is paying more in some instances for retirees than for people making the cars. Right, yeah. And then what happens? What happens? If you do it within a city or a state that has that problem, the jobs will move to a place that doesn't have that problem. And I don't want to see that happen. So as a result, we took far-reaching pension reforms, and I'm very proud of that.
But that behavior very quickly becomes institutionalized, doesn't it? Because once the people who go through a system and retire and are paid generously by whomever realize that this is coming to them, they don't like to give that up very easily. So don't you endanger support for not only that issue but other issues by ticking off those people who feel like, well, wait a minute, the people who came before me got these generous pensions, why shouldn't I get mine?
Maybe, but I mean, you're not, if you try to please everybody, you're not ever going to do anything. But what you try to do is you do what makes sense. And what I said on my public discussion about this, which again, people said, people will never understand this. And it was pretty simple. I'd like to pay people more to perform and less not to work. And people
get that.
People got, and I have employees of the cities, when they saw that we put in more money for every $2 of future benefits that were given up, not anything accrued already.
Right.
In some cases, like police, we had to start a brand new system for new hires. But for $2 you put in, I'll put $1 in of additional assets. I have had so many employees who've been watching what's happened in California and her coming and saying to me, thank goodness you did those pension reforms. I understand now why you did it.
Right. As a general rule, people who run for office promise the moon, and then when they get into office, they occasionally have to take back some of those promises. Right. But they're reluctant to because they know there's another election around the corner. Right. Talk to me about your willingness to confront people where they live in this case, and the fact that some of them may, I mean, you're running for the Senate now, and some of the people who had their pensions plans reformed may remember that at election time. How do you square that? Where is your responsibility in a case like that?
The public interest.
Yeah. Do you not think about Bill White's interest at any turn? You'd be the only person in the world who didn't in a case like that.
No, and this is what I think. I think that I'd like to be the person to prove that good government can be good politics. And right now, Texans are hungry for that.
Government's got a bad rap. That's a pretty big rock to push uphill.
I mean, people, they have all these, they create these large expectations, larger than what they can deliver, and there's too many people who confuse the photo op or the press conference or the speech for the solution or the results. There's too many sound bites, not enough solutions. There's a difference between landing on an aircraft carrier and declaring victory and victory, okay? There's a difference between signing a piece saying, well, I've signed this law and no child is left behind, and the fact that we have high dropout rates and there are children left behind. And in a world in which we have 2 wars going, a global recession, people are hungry for the politics of results and not rhetoric.
I'm guessing from what you just said, this is a guess, that you're not a big fan of President Bush's.
I mean, it doesn't really benefit. Nobody's going to redo the Bush presidency, so there's probably more fruitful things for us to talk about.
Well, all right. You were not just a Democrat before becoming mayor. You were chair of the Texas Democratic Party.
Right.
How hard was it for you to be a nonpartisan mayor of Houston? The mayoralty in Houston is nonpartisan, like in many big cities.
It wasn't hard.
Talk about bipartisanship.
It wasn't hard at all. When I took that job as chairman of the Democratic Party, there were people who asked, gosh, you're not that sort of like a strident person who shouts, invectives against people into a microphone. How are you going to do this? I said, well, you're right. I mean, I'm not that kind of person. But so maybe I won't do that good a job of shouting invectives into a microphone. But, to me, bringing people together is a natural. And there's a terrible misconception that if you build consensus, that means you're tepid. Mm-hmm. And I will tell you on what we've done on pollution, on energy efficiency, on going in and reviving blighted neighborhoods, on pension reform. If you build consensus on something that makes a lot of sense, then you can be bold because it's harder for people to stop you and frustrate you. Because those within the career bureaucracy knew that I had widespread bipartisan support within the community and on my city council, we could do things differently and in the past, and they could know that if I said, listen, if you have a different approach, then you could, leave our employment, that I could back that up.
To this question of nonpartisan mayoralty and bipartisan consensus building and everything else, let me ask you a question that may seem obvious, but it would be helpful to have you answer
Sure.
it, which is, why are you a Democrat?
Because when I was young, and that time where we start identifying with this or that party or beliefs, was right in the heart of the civil rights battle and movement. I remember the first time that I went sort of door to door. I was 10 years old. It was in San Antonio, and it was for Lyndon Johnson. And I could remember the first rude neighbor that I got, who had some views. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, for many people who are more libertarian conservatives, I'll say Barry Goldwater looks pretty good these days. But I felt that that was a cause of our time and was essential to who we as an American people were. And if you looked at, call it the Nixon strategy or state rights strategy, the political realignment, the party whose primary I now vote in, I think was on the right side of history, and the other party decided that they wanted to slow down the ultimate vindication of what our Declaration of Independence had promised. So,
and you believe that that party that you primary voted in then, this is still the party as the party is constituted and constructed today. You are unambivalent about your support of the Democratic Party.
Well, I don't buy into everything every person who calls himself a Democrat does or says. But
give me an example of one thing where you and your friends in the Democratic Party might not be in the same place.
Well, I'll tell you one thing where I'm not in the same place as a lot of Democrats and Republicans. I don't think the government should borrow a lot of money consistently to pay for operating expenses, federal government. I did something about that when I was in the Clinton administration. I wrote about that back in 1992 when I supported President Clinton, that I thought that somebody needed to take this deficit reduction seriously. Right. And it was very difficult to do so unless you increased, it's mathematically impossible unless you moderate your growth in spending, and if you have a deficit to begin with, your revenues have to go up more than your spending. And that's just a matter of math. And when I was in the federal government, I cut federal budgets, and I know how to do it. We built up surpluses for 4.5 years when I was mayor of Houston, so we could deal with economic downturns. And I think it's a matter of intergenerational fairness. It's the same type of issue as we deal with on good stewardship of our air and our water. Is
President Obama blowing it on the deficit?
I don't think he alone, but I think, as I look back, when the nation was growing, we were incurring trillions of dollars of deficit in the last administration, taking what were surpluses in the administration in which I served and turning them to chronic deficits, and that's borrowing. Nor do, and it is true that both President Bush and President Obama did encounter advice that they and other countries in Europe and East Asia, all throughout the world, needed to try to stimulate the economy to avoid a global depression. But, you know, the growth in the budget that was presented at the beginning of the year I thought was unwarranted. Not the, you know, so-called stimulus package, but the budget that's presented at the beginning of the year.
Okay, let's stay in Washington, since we're in the realm of Washington. Everybody who's tweeting will like this part of the conversation. You're running for the Senate. Mm-hmm. You sure?
Yeah.
You don't want to commit any news sitting here and say that maybe you're thinking differently about it, because there are an awful lot of people who either want you to run for governor or think you're going to run for governor despite what you say today.
Well, you remember the last time you asked me that
I've
question.
asked you this about 800 times. I've never gotten anything out of you. Let's try this time.
Well, I'll stick to the answer I gave you the last time you asked, which is that really I had a secret agenda to wait till we seceded from the Union, then run for president.
It was funnier back when it was secession time, though. In all seriousness, so there are people who say, well, let me ask, before I get into the governor thing, let me ask you to say in front of everybody, why are you running for the United States Senate?
Look, I'm running for the Senate because I think we need a voice in D.C. that'll just do what's right for Texas and not for one wing of one party. And I think we need a voice in our state that represents the public interest, somebody trying to represent all Texans, the values of our state, not some other state, rather than a special interest group. And we need that right now. So, you know, that's why we need to reduce the deficit. We need to, you know, wean our dependence on foreign oil and have more sustainable energy policies. We, at all levels of government, and state and local, or perhaps even more important than federal on this, need to educate our young people better, cut the dropout rate, remove barriers to higher education. These are important things for our state. And just to keep ahead of you, you know, governorship is important too, but, you know, there's only one of me.
But your background is in executive leadership. Whether it's been CEO of a company or mayor of Houston, you have been a politician whose hallmark has been executive leadership. Being one of 100 in the Senate or one of 535 in Congress does not play to that particular strength, whereas being governor of a state, even in a weak governor state, it's all about executive leadership. How does that square?
Oh my God, goodness, nobody's ever said that to me before.
Oh, well. You want to talk about secession again? Come on.
I got to process it.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, I think you need people who are making laws who have been responsible for implementing laws. Otherwise, it's a disaster. People can, well, you're reading in the newspaper these days about all the things, tax incentives of the IRS, where the IRS has got it wrong a lot of times just because there are so many incentives built in. They sent checks that they weren't supposed to send. They didn't send the checks they were supposed to send. Same thing, I don't care anything from military operations to making sure that stimulus funds get into the hands of people who can spend them and are spent within the time periods. You need to know, have had some operating experience in order to do that. But, you know, I'm not going to get into this and that's important. The state have a, you know, a governor is a leader too. So, you know, I can only run for one thing at a time. Is
there no circumstance that you can imagine, none at all, in which you would move over from the Senate race to the governor's race?
Well, certainly if they change the Constitution to make it so that senators serve for life and they grandfathered current people. No, you know, I really don't gauge in hypotheticals. I'm sorry.
So you are not running for governor, conclusively?
I'm running. I mean, the papers I filed legally say I'm running for senator. That's what I'm doing.
Okay. Let's pretend that you are. Let's pretend that you are in that case Senator White.
Yep.
Okay, Senator White. You have a health care bill that is about to come before you and your colleagues. Do you support a public option?
I have reservations about a public option, but I do think there's a lot of good that's in the Baucus bill, and I do think we need to pass legislation that contains health care costs. I think both those who are knowledgeable in both the House and Senate, when you press the thing that is called the public option, or that was called the public option in the beginning, which is a nonprofit plan in which it would be sustained by premium income that would cover the same costs of the system that would be currently covered by nonprofit and for-profit plans. I do not think there would be many people for whom that would be a real option. It wouldn't cut the number of uninsured compared, for example, to what we've done and now we've instituted within Houston and Harris County that I've advocated for years.
Talk about that.
See, we have a problem here in that we have these comprehensive health plans that are priced very high, $1,000 a month for a family of 4 for a lot of small businesses. And if you can't afford that, then you have nothing. And it's the emergency room if you get in trouble. Imagine if you could buy a new car or you could walk. What we need is a product that would be affordable for the employee, employer, and when we do the math and look at the actuarial analysis, it does require some amount of a public contribution to that, which I think is affordable in light of the avoided cost. We call it 3-share. So for example, for a family of 4, with a $120 a month contribution by the employer, about $78 a month for the employee, and a little less by a private contribution or a public contribution, we can cover over 80% of the healthcare needs of the population, including all the primary healthcare needs. Now, you don't cover 3 months in MD Anderson, so it doesn't the highest end major medical. That ought to be a separate product, and there ought to be a plan for dealing with that. But the kind of thing that I described, it could be offered by a public entity, which is right now, we've started offering it through a public entity, or it could be our for-profit plan. But there you are addressing the problem, which is affordability for the small business, so you have more and more people who can get group health insurance.
So you would or would not support the bill that it appears is going to come before the Senate right now?
I think that the Baucus bill, with a couple of changes, is an improvement, and I don't not know what exactly is going to come before the Senate. I think people are trying to thresh that out. Mm-hmm. But let me say, if you take what was in the Baucus bill, and you look at the number of people that would have insurance, you compare it to what Governor Romney, who last I checked did not run as a flaming liberal, as I recall, did in Massachusetts. There's a lot of common features. And finally, if you go back to what the Greater Houston Partnership, which is an umbrella business organization of 150 businesses who convened a health care task force at the request of me and the county judge, headed by Rob Mossbecker and with people on my team in the medical center. There's a lot of what's contained, at least in that Baucus bill, that was recommended as a type of changes by the business community in Houston. And what I think is a shame is that the public debate has become so polarized and hijacked that when we turn on the TV and we get 20 different members of Congress and the Senate commenting on this, it is as if there's no common ground at all, and you hear the same 2 or 3 talking points from each of them. We deserve better than that on the public dialogue and an issue that's so important to our state.
Okay. Should the troop levels in Afghanistan be increased, as some have suggested? The president seems to be wavering on what to do, and now there's some suggestion that he might not recommend a troop level or approve a recommended troop level at all.
Yeah, my view is, well, the first thing is, just to give you a sense over the long run, I'd tend to give a lot of weight and views both to the commander-in-chief and to the theater commander. And so we'll see where the president goes out.
But they seem to be in conflict, though.
Well, no, President Obama hadn't made his decision. Certainly the 3-star general who's now currently the ambassador in Afghanistan, who knows the region extensively, has a different view than General McChrystal. And those 2 of them talk, by the way, and respect each other. But I think, Evan, if we keep the mission, which had been articulated in the last administration and continued in this administration, then we ought to support mission with the resources that the theater commander requests, or replace the theater commander if we think those are not good. Our big issue in Afghanistan is how are we going to define a mission? Because see,
it's kind of late in the game to be first asking that question, isn't it?
yeah, well, it is, but you remember how, I mean, you can't change the history, and let's just review the bidding. Most of us, I even wrote, in the Chronicle before any announcement, right after 9/11, that, and actually before 9/11, I had written that we needed to I had an editorial, we need to retool our military so that they could respond to terrorist activities such as those activities posed by the Taliban. This is back in 2000, I wrote that. When we found that you had al-Qaeda camps there that had perpetrated this organized violence against the company, it was very clear there was a great international consensus in the United States and Europe. We ought to go and clean out the terrorist training camps that we had. But then you had a number of people, and they were in both parties, who said, oh, in addition to that, we need to replace the host regime, the Taliban. And in addition to that, in light of what had happened the last time we covertly intervened in Afghanistan, we ought to rebuild the society of Afghanistan. I mean, those things were done, and they were said. The problem that we have is the limits of limited war. You got to carefully define what those limit is, and then provide the resources to meet that goal. And now the policy debate, and it's a debate among Americans with good heart, is should we care and should our future be conditioned on what regime there is in Kabul? Or should we simply make sure that Afghanistan does not become a training ground for terrorists in the future?
Can we really do that?
Can we do what?
Can we really make sure that Afghanistan is not a training ground for terrorists?
Well, make sure, but we can have troops in the region. We can have both human and military intelligence, and we can sure provide a great deterrent for any regime in Afghanistan to overtly harbor the terrorists. You saw how quickly the Taliban were scrambling right after 9/11 to get those people out. So I think we could do that, but I wish we would have thought about, some people would have thought about that a little while ago.
Mayor, would you like to take some questions from the audience? Sure. You may have some questions that I didn't think to ask myself. If you want to hit him back on that governor stuff, Phil Martin, you may want to do that. I'm going to have a hard time seeing through the lights, so let me call over there and then over here, and I promise to call people in the back as well. Ma'am.
A great question about the job creation measures. I think as we revitalize our economy for the short run, we can't forget the long run. I'm much more concerned about long run American competitiveness than I am on how much employment we had just in 1 month. And so to keep our eye on those three things, I think we need a tax structure that encourages exports. I think we need to have a dollar that is not constantly undermined by this unacceptable dependence on foreign oil. I think we need to do a better job of managing the federal debt. And above all, we need to educate our people and train and retrain our workforce better. And if you don't keep your eye on that over 10 or 20 years, regardless of whatever stimulus you pass, you're going to be behind. And you're going to see, when we do come out of recessions, that you'll have a chronically high residual unemployment rate.
Are you pro-stimulus or anti-stimulus, by the way, as far as this conversation goes?
In what, I mean, Frank, in what do you mean? In what
what I mean is that very possibly at the first of the year or after the first of the year, the president may come back to Congress and ask for a second stimulus.
If he does that, I'm against it, period.
You are against it?
I mean, if he comes back. The issue, a lot of people have benefit of hindsight about what happened when the chairman of the Fed told both presidents, you better stimulate the economy, otherwise we're going into depression. But there comes a point, but I'll tell you what I'm adamantly opposed to. About 18 months ago, you had, and I think they were sincere in their beliefs. I don't think it was calculating, it's just a difference in approach. You had President Bush, Senator McCain, and Senator Clinton all endorse the idea, and the congressional leadership, of borrowing $180 billion and then sending the money to the taxpayers and saying, we hope everybody consumes. I think that is, if you have an economic crisis brought on by excessive debt and not enough saving, and people cut back their consumption, it is not a good long-term policy to borrow more money and tell people to spend it on consumer goods. That's just a fact. And people need to know that fact.
Here, and then in the back, and then to the side. Ma'am.
Yes. Well, you know, what a great question, because if you compare Texas to a lot of different states in the country, what happens is that for low-income working poor in other states, you have the more Medicaid availability where you get $2 federal dollars for every local dollar. And here, many of our low-income working people, they use the emergency rooms in the public hospital systems, or they use others and cannot pay, go into bankruptcy, and then the cost of that uninsured is passed on to everybody else through higher group premiums. So Texas has not done a good job of getting our fair share of the federal dollars, which we pay as taxpayers coming back to this state to defray the cost of the working people who just don't have access to group health insurance.
Up at the top and then the side.
You know, look, I mean, maybe I'm a little old-fashioned in this, but somebody says they're going to resign, you know, I tend to believe them. I'm not trying to be naive, but you got to ask yourself this: why would she go around saying she's going to resign if she's not? I mean, maybe it requires. Anyway, I'm not professionally trained in that, but
her decision to resign, her decision to not resign to this point, and a potential decision not to resign after the primary, if she were to lose, would not dissuade you. You still run in 12.
You know,
right?
That is, if you want the general topic, you know, maybe my answer was too long about Afghanistan or too substantive about health care. Just on my, this is the way I look at it, as far as me. I enjoy campaigning, I enjoy governing. Every day that I'm on the campaign trail, I meet people around the state, and I know people want somebody to be an effective voice for this state. There's going to be elections. It's important we have a good governor. It's important we have a good next senator that has real influence. And I've said about as much as I can say without seeming repetitive.
Before we get to this next question, since Paul brought it up, would you quickly characterize the Democratic field then, since you won't be part of it by your own assertion? Tom Schieffer, Farouk Shami just announced yesterday, your fellow Houstonian, Kinky Friedman, Hank Gilbert, Felix Alvarado, a group of people. Do you have a word you want to say about that group?
I'll answer the question. No. No, but I'm not. I mean,
that's an answer.
But no, but let me just say this too. I mean, I think there's, you know, fine people running for public office, and it takes a lot of guts to file for public office and to run for public office. And I'm sure, you know, most, if not all, those people are dissatisfied with the direction of our state.
If any one of those represented your party for governor in the fall, you'd be comfortable voting for him?
Well, you know, that's a clever question.
Ma'am?
Great question. For energy policy, we need to do three things. And you will reduce both consumer prices and carbon emissions if you do these three things in the right sequence. One, greatly improve the efficiency of fuel efficiency in vehicle use, right? Greatly improve the efficiency of fuel consumption in vehicles. We can do it with hybrids. Trucks should be hybrids. We ought to have more aggressive, and with that alone, if we move to better fuel economy standards, legislation that created the original fuel economy standards I worked on 34 years ago as a legislative assistant, we could cut our oil imports by 4 million barrels a day in this country and really prevent oil from being soaring up to, over $100 a barrel for a long time. Two, we need to use energy more efficiently in our buildings. And we could do that. If you looked at what we've done in Houston, it can be done. And that way we wouldn't need a lot of big new power plants for a long time within this country. And number three, we got to take the types of power plants that we currently have to produce electricity and replace some of those coal-fired plants with cleaner fuels. In the next 10 years, that means natural gas and renewables. And then after that point, depending on the economics, and the economics in turn depends on the siting of the decision, it may be nuclear. But it shouldn't be just as a mandate. I mean, it should depend in part on the economics and on the siting of the plants.
We have time for about 5 minutes. Well, let's take a couple more. I'd like to take a couple from that side. I'm having a hard time seeing. Ma'am, right there, and then we'll try to go behind you. Yeah.
First, our dropout rates are high. They're in that 40% range for many, many places of the state. And any journalism student or reporter, there's some easy way to get at it, which is go through and look at the number of freshmen in the high schools over a period of time and the number of graduating seniors. We're the fastest growing state. We're one of the youngest states, so all of our kids aren't moving somewhere else, which was the old explanation of why they couldn't do it. And you'll see we have a much higher dropout rate than some of the school, bureaucrats said we do. What we've done with our expectation graduation, I think can be a model if it gets support nationwide. Here's what we do. There's many parts of it. First, we engage the community. It just can't be the teacher alone that finds out what happens when a young person doesn't come back to school. Look, if there's a high school football game and somebody's hit on the field and somebody's knee is torn up, all of us, including the parent of an athlete, I'm there, rising on the stands. We're hoping and praying that the young person gets back up and that she, an ambulance arrives to take her away, quickly, and we applaud. It's an emergency. Yeah, it is an emergency but when a young person doesn't show up for school, 2 or 3 days in a row, no explanation. Where did the alarm bells go off? Where's the ambulance that shows up? And yet that has far more long-term consequences for not only that person, but society as a whole, compared to whether somebody has torn a knee up. You know what I'm saying? And I think then, so what we do, and it started small, but now it's big, is at the beginning of every school year, if kids have not come back, my wife and I, and we have 1,500 citizens with us, civic leaders, clergy, and the bishop in Corpus Christi, when we started it there, was with a knock on the door and bring the young person back into school if we can, talk to the parents, get their commitment. And what we found from that experience is you need certain programs. I'll give you 3 to keep them in school. For some of your young mothers, there needs to be nurseries. For some people who need to work, if it's part-time, you need jobs within the vicinity of the school that they could do after school. Or for some of those kids, we need flexible working hours in the school where they can take that job in the afternoon and come back and make up those courses at night. We got to recognize that there's a problem. We do it with the community colleges. We have to realize that there's some people who must have that extra paycheck in order to make the ends meet at their house. And then you have those who've gotten way behind. And if you doubt that we can do it and bring them up, then you should have seen what we did during Katrina. We had 25,000 people come to our schools. We tested them The median, Evan, was 18 months behind the grade level of folks we had in Houston schools. It wasn't genetic. It wasn't that they were dumb kids. It wasn't that every kid was 18 months behind, but they had lower. So within 18 months of that, largely with private funding that I raised, supplementing some commitments by the school district, no extra money from the feds, I'll tell you, even though it was promised. We brought them up to there was no statistical difference. And you know how we did it? You know how we did it? It wasn't some innovative new program. Tutoring and summer school. Have you heard of those? You can bring kids up to grade level. Those are some of the things that we can do. And then the high at risk, we need to start early. We started something, I started it, called Summer Opportunity Sessions based on a Brookings study where after second grade, if kids want to come to school and learn hands-on science and reading programs and supplement, a lot of the parents are working. They don't mind the kids going to the elementary school. And it offsets what's called summer learning loss that any elementary school will tell you about. It takes up through September to get to where they were in reading and math. These kids came back kids from very low-income schools, and they were better than they were when they left school May, and this is even better. We went back and resurveyed the next April. We've done this now 3 straight years. Surveyed the next April, and these kids, compared to their prior performance and their control group, went from 40% of the national percentile average to 60% with 5 intensive weeks in summer school. Why can't we do that throughout this country and throughout this state? We could.
Take one last one and then we're going to have to wrap it up. Sir.
Oh, I thought you were going to ask the ideal senator from Texas, and I
think I know what your answer to that is.
Balding. I don't know. If you want to say, how will somebody misconstrue this? I'm a Texan. This is what our governor should be. Forget the politics of it. The governor should be a leader and not a follower. A governor should be somebody who decides that, they're not a protester. They're not on the outside. They're responsible for leading the state. The governor should be somebody who doesn't pit Texan against Texan. The governor of a state where the two parties are fairly evenly divided with a large independent section. And by the way, this should also apply to senator in many regards. Should be somebody who is not so overtly partisan, because that will interfere with your ability to bring people together to get things done. I don't care, Democrat or Republican, they shouldn't be going to upstate New York to campaign for a congressperson. There's a lot of work to be doing right here in Texas. Senator or governor, when there's appointments, the litmus test should not be how much money somebody contributed to your campaign. And if you appoint good people to places and offices where they ought to be, then they don't all of a sudden become unqualified just because they support an opponent. The business of state government, be it state representative, state senator, lieutenant governor, speaker of the House, the principal business line of state government is education. And of the days of the year, you ought to look at how people allocate the time, and if improving the schools of the state should be reflective of the most important business of that job and other jobs. Just like with me in the mayor's business, and for the mayor, my most important businesses, the things that I do to serve the public, are public safety, infrastructure, water, sewer services, maintaining good streets and roads, and making sure that we are able to improve our neighborhoods with parks and libraries and pick up the garbage on time, that type of thing. that they're all important for job development. So I've given you.
But just to wrap this up, to the questioner's point, though, does it matter to you running for the Senate whether there's a strong Democrat on the top of the ticket? Do you distance yourself from anybody else running, or do you tie yourself to the fate of the ticket that happens top to bottom?
You know, I'm really not sure what operationally that means that is. I'm not one of these people who decide that I'm going to have my picture not taken with somebody or shy away because somebody will frame it and send it on YouTube, you know, or whatever. I mean, my goodness, I have my picture taken with almost anybody who wants to take a picture with me, if I have time. You know, so I'm not one of. I'm not a good schemer. Okay, in other words, but.
Well, then you'd be a lousy governor after all.
But I'll run based on who I am and what Texans are, not based on, you know, what somebody else wants to do. Right? That's the best I can say.
Well, I'll tell you what you are, Mayor White. You're a good sport because you put up with this for an hour and you didn't crack, and I appreciate it. And I know how much we all appreciate the fact that your schedule is very busy. You spent time with us. We thank you very much. Regardless of whether you win, we wish you good luck and thank you for your service to Texas.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.